Ага.
Ну, нет, сегодня Всем здравствуйте, добрый вечер. Спасибо, что пришли на сегодняшний урок. Урок будет проводить Денис на тему развития внешнего туризма в Казахстане. Вы можете оставлять свои вопросы в чат-боксе. Спикер будет отвечать на них в конце урока. И, в принципе, на этом все. Спасибо, что пришли на урок. Я передаю слова Денису.
Hi there, everybody. So it's lovely to see everybody coming in this evening. What we're going to do today is I'll be introducing myself, telling you a little bit about my story, how I came from California to Kazakhstan. And then we're going to talk about some of my opinions about how to develop external tourism in Kazakhstan. And then I'll be turning the mic over to the audience, and hopefully at the end we'll have some time for a Q&A. So you're welcome to leave questions, comments in the chat box, or if you want to save your question till the end and ask on video, that's fine too. But I'm definitely looking forward to that part, to hearing from all of you guys. So I am going to hop over to my presentation real quick. So yeah, let me begin by sharing a little bit about me. So my name is Dennis Keen, and I'm the founder of a project called Walking Almaty. And though I'm originally from Southern California, I've been living here in Kazakhstan, based here for the most part since 2013, so for about 8 years now. And my journey started actually way back in 2005, when I was 17 years old. I found a program that was sending American kids to Kazakhstan. It was an organization called Youth for Understanding that organizes these exchanges. And to be honest, at that point, I knew very little about Kazakhstan. I was just looking for some kind of summer program that would give me an opportunity to travel. And I was looking at the different options, and most of them were pretty conventional. You know, go to Europe, go to Japan, and then I saw Kazakhstan on the website. And I remember it just thinking immediately how amazing it seemed that this place, which was so kind of unknown and exotic to me, was accessible. And so I signed up for this program. And a few months later, I was in Kazakhstan. So I spent that summer, about 2.5 months, living in Almaty with a Kazakh family. They knew very little English, so it was a lot of talking with my hands and slowly learning Russian and Kazakh. So I started to take lessons at a local school here. We got to travel around the country, go to Astana, go to Turkestan, go to Shymkent. And this was the moment where I really fell in love with the country. But to be honest, at that point, I wasn't quite sure how I would get back. That was until I went and did my undergraduate at a school in the University of California system, UC Santa Cruz. And I had a great Russian professor there. I was able to study Russian for a couple of years, and that kind of continued to kindle my interest in the region. This is me and my host mom, Gideon. So in 2009, actually, I got to go back to Central Asia, though not to Kazakhstan, but to Mongolia. And in Mongolia is where I was teaching English for a summer, and I started to become really interested in traditional Kazakh life and ethnography. And I started a research project about eagle hunting. So I went out to Western Kazakhstan, to the province of Bayan-Olgi, where there's this ancient tradition of hunting with eagles. Started to do ethnographic fieldwork that I then used to write a thesis paper in anthropology at my university. And that began this kind of longer project I had called the Central Asian Falconry Project. So this was continued. In 2010, 2011, I got a Fulbright fellowship to fund research in Kyrgyzstan. And I went and met hunters, conducted interviews, gathering information about this really interesting tradition and how it survived in the modern day. And I published my research eventually on a website called the Central Asian Falconry Project. And for several years of my life, this was my main interest, was about how Central Asians capture, train, and hunt with these birds of prey. So I got to travel with Kyrgyz and Kazakh falconers to the Middle East, to Qatar and to Dubai, to different falconry competitions. I got to go to Western China, to the Chinese Altai Mountains, where I met Kazakh falconers. And these were some of the greatest adventures of my life. The last chapter before I finally came to Kazakhstan in 2013 was I was able to do a program at Stanford University in California, a really unusual program. So there are just a handful of universities in America that have these kind of post-Soviet studies centers where you're studying not just Russian, but the languages and cultures of the entire former Soviet space. And usually the names are quite a handful. For example, the one at Stanford where I studied was called the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And there was a Kazakh professor there named Professor Almaty, who's quite a well-known ethnographer who I got to study with for a year. So we studied Kazakh together. We studied about Kazakh myths and traditions, cinema, basically all things Kazakhstan. I got this crash course for this whole year at Stanford. And for me, Stanford was an amazing opportunity, but it was also just a kind of jumping point for me to get back to Kazakhstan. Because while I was at Stanford, I got another linguistic scholarship that sent me to Almaty in the summer of 2013 with something called the American Council's Eurasian Regional Language Program. So this sent me to study Kazakh at Kimet. You'll have to excuse me, please, my coughing, because I've been a little bit sick the last few days. But so at Kimet, I got to study Kazakh for a summer. And at that point, I knew I had really invested in learning the languages in Russian and Kazakh and learning about the culture. I was tired of learning about it from books in the library in California. I was excited to live here in Kazakhstan and to explore this place on my own. So when I went to Kazakhstan in 2013, I bought a one-way ticket. And I've pretty much been based here ever since. I go back every year to see my family, of course, but this is my home now here in Almaty. And I have Kazakh family, so this was the second Kazakh host family that I stayed with that summer. And so now I have two Kazakh families, two Kazakh host families. I have a Kazakh family of my own because I got married to a Kazakh girl, had a kid. So my life I really put down roots here in Kazakhstan. So if that's just a little bit of a background about how I got here. Once I got here, I started teaching English and I started to work on a project called Walking Almaty. And Walking Almaty began as a blog to document my explorations of the city. And I called it Walking Almaty because I only walked on foot. So this is a map where the red lines are all the streets that I walked down, I believe, those first 2 years in Almaty. So I was quite obsessive about this, of exploring kind of every neighborhood of the city, and not just the central parts, but some of the peripheral areas that even most Almatians never get to see. So along the way, as I was walking, I was taking photographs, and I put the photographs in this website, walkingalmaty.com, which became kind of a depository for this kind of documentation I was doing of the urban landscape here. I was trying to determine through my photography what is special about Almaty, what kind of gives it that certain irresistible charm that it has. And so I made what I call an urban field guide. So just as you can go into nature and identify birds or plants, when you're in Almaty, this field guide can help you identify elements of the architecture, for example. So, these are these very specific architectural elements called brise-soleil that you can find on Soviet modernist buildings. Or, quirky little details in the частный sector, like the way people make their own doorbells. And it was these small details that I kind of collected. And when they add up, they really paint this picture of quite an amazing place to explore. So I explored it. And eventually people started to tell me that I've seen more of Almaty than most Almatinsi. And they said, you should be doing tours. So I started having visitors and I was doing tours for them of the architecture of the city. And eventually I started my own tour company called Walking Almaty, where I started to offer historical and architectural tours of the city. And so for the last 5 years, maybe 6 years now, I've been doing those tours, meeting hundreds, if probably not thousands at this point, of visitors from around the world who are coming to Almaty as tourists. And I have the honor and the privilege to show them that. Starting in 2016, because of my work with Walking Almaty, I got the attention of some television producers, and I got hired to host a television program on the channel Kazakh TV, and the program was called Discovering Kazakhstan. And this was an amazing experience where for 3 seasons, I was able to travel around the country, see so many amazing sites with a small film crew. And I got to do what I love, which is share my love of Kazakhstan with an audience. So, this took me to Turkestan. And to this day, the most popular episode of Discovering Kazakhstan is the episode where we filmed my wedding. So while I was a TV host, I was planning to get married. And I asked my producer if they wouldn't mind filming the wedding. And so we did a whole episode about the toy. And we had a very kind of traditional Kazakh toy mixed in with some American elements. My American family came out from California to visit. So if you guys like afterwards, check out this episode because it's something that I'm proud of, and it's obviously one of the best days of my life. So in the last few years, one specific kind of focus of study for me has been about something that I started to collect on Walking Almaty, which is the monumental art of Almaty. So specifically these kind of Soviet mosaics and different public artworks that you can find in the city. It's important to note that this is something that is quite specific to Soviet cities. It's certainly, where I come from, you can't find many mosaics on the streets. But when I was walking around Almaty, I would see these beautiful canvases. And it was difficult to find any good information about them, about who were the artists who made them, when were they made, how were they made. So I started to do this research project where, much like with Walking Almaty, I was documenting these with photography, meeting the artists, and making a catalog. So I made a website called monumentalalmaty.com, where you can find photographs of these different kinds of public art. So not just mosaics, but also stained glass windows and murals and bas-relief sculptures. All of them are collected on this website, where for each object of art in Almaty, you can find a catalog entry with the name of the artist, with the year it was made, with the title. And this has become a really useful resource for tourists who are coming to Almaty, who are interested in this kind of Soviet legacy, helps them find these amazing works of art. But it's also been a really useful resource for locals and a way to kind of promote interest in this art form and promote public support to save it. So we've had some very successful campaigns where we've been able to save some works of monumental art that were under threat. Now, most recently, the last 2 years, I've been hired by an American university in California. It's part of the University of California, or UC system. And it's called the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, where they have one of these similar departments called the Department of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Languages and Cultures. And so they hired me because at UCLA, they have a very strong Russian language program. And for years now, they've been sending their Russian language students to Kazakhstan to study Russian. It's a program called the Language Flagship that actually several American universities participate in, where they collectively send their students over to the former Soviet Union, to Russian-speaking countries. Before, they used to send them mostly to Russia, but because of political tension between the US and Russia, they started to send them to Almaty instead. So imagine every year you have hundreds of these American students who are coming to study in Almaty, mostly at KazNU. And the language flagship in UCLA quickly realized that these students should have more of a knowledge than just Russian language, but should also have a knowledge of Kazakh language and of Kazakh history and culture as well. So for the last 2 years, I've been teaching 2 small courses there, one on the history and culture of Kazakhstan, and one which is a basic Kazakh language course. Unfortunately, I started this job right as the pandemic hit. So for the last 2 years, I haven't actually been able to be at UCLA on campus, but I've taught over Zoom. But it's been a real joy to meet these students back in America who also have an interest in Kazakhstan and who kind of come with me on this journey of learning the language and learning about the history and the culture. So those are just some of the projects that I've been able to work on in these years, from the Walking Almaty blog to my tour business, to my mosaic documentation, to my work as a teacher. If there's any kind of common thread that unites all of my projects and interests, it's an overall desire to share this country with the rest of the world. And the reason why this is important is that we often forget, living in Kazakhstan, unfortunately, just how unknown Kazakhstan is to the rest of the world. And this becomes a problem when tourism becomes a main growing industry in the country, where in the last 5 years, we've seen major investment in growing external tourism. Yet how do we get external tourists to come to Kazakhstan in the first place if they know very little about it? So that's what we're going to be looking at very quickly in today's lecture, is how do we kind of address this problem of name recognition and of marketing the country. I started to think about this seriously last fall when the Borat film came out. So this was in October 23rd, I believe the second Borat film was coming out. The whole world was talking about Borat, was talking about Kazakhstan, and I got frustrated that that there didn't seem to be any kind of positive strategy how to use this hype to Kazakhstan's benefit. Instead, there was a lot of controversy, a lot of arguments, a lot of anger, much of which was understandable. But certainly from the government side, there was no response. So I put out an idea on my social media channels to make a Borat-themed tourism campaign where we would use Borat's catchphrase, "Very nice," as the official slogan of Kazakhstan. So I brought this to the folks at Kazakh Tourism. They gave it the green light. And over a few days, we shot a video with some friends, put the video online, and this video went viral. So here it was picked up by the New York Times in an exclusive article. After that, it was published. Stories about this were published in every major publication, pretty much every major print publication in the world, in over 100 languages. And the video now has 1.3 million views, making it the most successful tourism campaign in Kazakhstan's history. The thing is, it's quite a simple idea, and the idea kind of relied on just a few basic principles. So there's some basic lessons that we can take away from this campaign. Just a second here. Here's the video.
Very nice. That's actually very nice.
Very nice. Very nice.
So very simple, right? It's just sorry, just this. It's a very simple concept. We took this catchphrase that people associate with Borat, which is very nice, and then we realized that it applies as a really great description of Kazakhstan, that the people of Kazakhstan are very nice, that the food is very nice, the cities are very nice, et cetera, et cetera. And so what kind of lessons can we take away from this campaign? First of all, it's to be realistic about the kind of lack of name recognition that Kazakhstan has, and to be realistic about its associations with Borat. So in a second, we're going to be doing an exercise where we kind of look at what kind of existing associations there are. But for much of the Western world, Borat is the first thing that people think of when they think of Kazakhstan. And instead of kind of being ashamed of that and ignoring it, with this campaign, we showed that it's better to use it in a productive way that could bring some benefits to Kazakhstan. Another principle I think it shows is that you have to work with what you have. You have to work with the existing brand associations to create some kind of hook. Because there are so few associations with Kazakhstan and so little name recognition. Whatever connections you have are your opportunities to tell a story. And so we'll be talking about some of those existing associations and how those hooks can be used to create buzz around the country and its tourism potential. And then lastly, I think a principle that we follow with this, which is that the campaign was not necessarily marketed towards tourists, meaning these kind of mass tourists, group tourists, but instead to a different sector, which I describe as travelers. So these are who are most of my tour guests are usually young, independent, solo travelers who are planning the trip on their own and are organizing everything on their own, don't exactly have the highest expectations for comfort, are willing to sacrifice some creature comforts as long as they have an adventurous experience. So with the kind of imagery that we were showing in the videos, where we're not showing big tour groups, but we're showing these solo individual travelers, we were able to market to this segment. So of course, when we talk about marketing Kazakhstan to an external audience, the immediate problem that we come up against is that Kazakhstan simply is unknown. If you think about other major tourist destinations in the world, whether it's Egypt or Japan or Paris, these are places that have associations. You say the name and a thought comes to mind. You can imagine the landscape. You can imagine the architecture. You can imagine the food and the people. And unfortunately, because of a number of factors, because Kazakhstan is so young, because it has a small population, it's relatively unknown in the Western world. So the very first brand association that people have is where? Where is that? And a lot of people simply can't find Kazakhstan on the map, even though it is the 9th largest country in the world. And so if the most common reaction is probably where, the second most common brand association with Kazakhstan is Borat. And as we saw with this video, the Very Nice campaign, it was a much more effective strategy to recognize that, to admit that, and to use that than to fight it. Because some of you might remember when the first movie came out, the Kazakh government had a very outraged campaign where they said, we're offended, this is disgusting. And it just added more fuel to the fire without creating that much interest in Kazakhstan itself. So Borat is an association that's there, it's not going away, and Kazakhstan has to find ways to use that to its benefit. So what other brand associations are there with Kazakhstan? Basically, if you can find people who are a little bit more educated or well-read, they may know some other things about the country. Generally, they might know about the Soviet and Russian legacy here. If they read the newspaper, they might know about the politics. If they're into history, they might know about the Silk Road that came through Kazakhstan. If they're into space and tech, they might know about Baikonur. People might know about Central Asia and its nomads and the imagery that's associated with that, like the yurts and the horses. And in general, Central Asia, a lot of people would know that it's an Islamic region. But these associations even are quite limited. I want to emphasize that for most of the target audience of external tourists, the #1 association is zero, is nothing. They have nothing to work with at all, and they would struggle to find where Kazakhstan is on a map. So This is it's quite a hard pill to swallow, but it's necessary to be realistic about this if we're going to find effective strategies to market the country to these people. So far, what we've seen is a good example of what not to do, in my opinion, is that the overall emphasis of tourism campaigns in the last few years coming out of Kazakhstan has been a focus on ecotourism. Now, of course, you might think, well, Kazakhstan has beautiful nature, right? We have amazing mountains and canyons and deserts and lakes, and it's relatively untouched. And this is exactly what adventurous tourists are looking for. So why don't we help create this new association in tourist minds by showing them beautiful imagery from Kazakhstan? I'll tell you why I think that this doesn't work. First of all, it's oversaturation. So the existing audience is so bombarded with different images of beautiful nature on Instagram and Pinterest and TikTok that it's really hard to break through all that imagery. And that leads me to number two, which is that it's very hard to make an impression with Kazakhstan's eco-tourist destinations, simply because they are not distinct enough to stand out against the competition. When you have to compete with the rainforests of Southeast Asia, or the amazing karst landscape of southern China, or the Grand Canyon, these world marvels, it's really hard for Kazakhstan's relatively modest natural wonders to stand out. And secondly, much of the landscape in Kazakhstan resembles the landscape where our target audience lives, which is in Europe or in North America. So, as beautiful as this scene that we see here, for example, if I want, I can go and see the same landscape in Colorado. And it'll be a lot easier for me to go from California to Colorado than it is for me to go from California to Kazakhstan. So my general thesis is that if you want to get people, Western tourists, to travel halfway around the world to come to a country as unknown as Kazakhstan, nature is not enough. Ecotourism is not enough of a hook because it's not distinctive enough to break through. So instead, our task is to find those distinctive associations and to build our hooks on that. So how can we leverage these existing associations? And then later, after we do that, how can we build new associations? So if we look at those existing associations that I brought up, we can get creative about how to turn these into tour products. So this was just a brainstorm that all of you can use as inspiration, where if you have visitors, for example, who are interested in the Russian and Soviet legacy of Kazakhstan, then you show them Soviet architecture, or you take them to the polygon, or you take them to the gulags, or you take them to even abandoned cities, ghost cities. And what's remarkable is that even though there's huge unmet demand for this amongst Western tourists who are interested in the Soviet legacy, that demand is not being met by the Kazakhstani market, largely because I think of kind of an internal politics, an internal discomfort with showing the darker sides of the Soviet legacy, or with showing the Soviet legacy at all. I think it's quite meaningful that when tourism officials here want to present Kazakhstan, they mostly present an ancient past, right? They build etno auls where you can go and pretend to be a nomad and ride horses. And that traditional Kazakh culture certainly has a place, but it doesn't reflect the full picture of contemporary Kazakhstan, which, and especially urban Kazakhstan, which largely grew out of this Soviet and Russian legacy. So, when it comes to a market, an industry like tourism, it's not necessary to be politically correct. Instead, you have to listen to what the audience is telling you and to try to provide them something that they can have some kind of emotional attachment with. Even if you look at politics, the first President Nazarbayev has become well known around the world as a strong leader, why can't there be tours that are built around Yelbasa and his cult of personality? Just last month, I went to go visit his hometown, Shemogan. We went to the Nazarbayev Museum. We went to the Nazarbayev School. We went to the Nazarbayev Family Cemetery. And I can see that there'd be a lot of interest among foreign tourists in kind of learning more about this important historical figure. But again, many local tour providers are more kind of concerned about political sensitivities than about what kind of demand there might be from this audience. Silk Road is a common association that is used amongst tour providers here, but I still think that there are some missed opportunities here. Turkestan, obviously, people have seen, has been developing quite quickly in the last 2 years, but it still remains a bit of a mystery for most foreign tourists. Foreign tourists know about the Silk Road overall, and they have a broad picture, but about the city of Turkestan, they know nothing. And certainly about Ahmed Yasawi and the importance of his mausoleum, they know nothing. So Turkestan does have a lot of potential, but first they need to build a stronger narrative where tourists can understand the importance of this place. And second, they need to involve tourists themselves in the story, in the pilgrimage. Because we all know that Kazakhs from around the country go to Turkestan and they complete this pilgrimage, and there's certain things you do, right? Where you go around the mausoleum, you say prayers. There are a lot of holy sites around the world where foreign tourists are given the privilege to take part in this, to participate in them themselves. So why not invite the world to also participate in this kind of Turkestani pilgrimage? With Baikonur, a lot of people around the world hear about these rocket launches that take place a couple times a year where astronauts and cosmonauts are sent back up to space. One thing that I've been studying over the last year is about how the cosmonauts come back from space, where they land back on planet Earth. And the first place that they land is, of course, Kazakhstan. This is an amazing fact that can be used to promote tourism. So I was able to go to a cosmonaut landing in April, for example. I was the only tourist there. I visited locations around the country where historic cosmonaut landings took place. And there are plaques and monuments and rockets out in the steppe that nobody knows about. It's a huge opportunity as a way that Kazakhstan can tell its story to the world as the center of the history of human spaceflight. When it comes to traditional Kazakh life, of course, a lot of people have an association with nomads, with yurts and with horses, but I very much disagree with the current strategy that's generally taken, which is presenting this kind of traditional life in kind of a museumified format, where it's shown within the context of an ethno village, an ethnawul. This violates every trend in modern day tourism industry, where tourists are looking for cultural experiences that are authentic, that are real. And every tourist who comes to Kazakhstan is generally well-traveled, and they can smell from a mile away that an ethnol is fake, and it offends them. And they were much, much more likely to find memories that last by visiting real villages. Imagine that. So in Kyrgyzstan, you can go to almost any village in the country and stay with a family and ride their horses. And I've done this myself, and there's some of my favorite travel memories. But in all of Kazakhstan, there's only 2 villages that have any kind of guest house infrastructure at all. Same thing in Kyrgyzstan. It's very easy to go up into the mountains and to arrange a stay in a yurt, in a zhailao. In Kazakhstan, having that real nomadic experience is possible. In just a couple months ago, I was in Rayambekski Rayon, and I was staying at a zhailao with a real modern day nomad. That experience is not being marketed to tourists. So the proper approach, in my opinion, of promoting this kind of nomadic culture is to promote it in a way that's authentic and that feels relevant to modern day tourists. So those are just some of the basic existing associations that we have, because these are the hooks of how you get people's attention. You have to present something that they know about already, and then build an experience around that. It's one more reason why this nature is so hard, because people around the world, unfortunately, don't know about Shadinsky Kenya. They don't know about these amazing natural wonders. And so this is not going to motivate them to visit the country. It's going to be these existing associations and the interesting tour products that you can build around that. So in addition to, at first, building on those existing associations, you can then begin to build tourism products around future associations that don't yet exist in people's minds, but that have potential interest. So these are just things that, I personally associate with Kazakhstan, that I personally find to be one of my my favorite part about living here, but that you would struggle to market to an audience that's not familiar with Kazakhstan. So I love Kazakhstan's diverse cuisine, that you could eat Georgian food one night and Russian food the next, and Kazakh beshormak the day after that. I love the diverse people and cultures that, you can go to a Uyghur neighborhood and a Dungan village and an Uzbek mahala and a Kazakh owl. I love the contemporary culture. That Kazakh culture is not just something that's in the past, that's in the ethno in the museum, but that it's living and breathing and developing. And there's fascinating artists and musicians and people who are creating new things here, especially in Almaty. I love the nightlife, that there's bars and clubs and amazing speakeasies and cocktails that would be fun for any audience. I love the weddings, the toys, and most of all, just these urban landscapes, not just the nature, but the cities and the magic that Kazakhstani cities have to them. So these are things that I've learned to fall in love with living here, but they're a little bit harder than those existing associations because people simply don't know about them. So I consider this to be kind of a second order approach, where first you develop the existing associations, and then as you build a larger tourism audience, and once you get people here, these are products that you can present to them. So let's look about how we can kind of build some tourism products around these new associations. If you want to explore cuisines with tourists, one thing that I've organized in the past is shashlik crawls, where we go to Kampot, and in one night we visit 5 different shashlichnayas, and we try different kinds of shashlik. I had a melon party last summer where we went to the bazaar, bought 10 different types of melons, and had a melon taste test. There's actually a melon festival in Zhetisai, I want to say it's called, in southern Kazakhstan, where it's a whole event built around melons. Amazing. I wish the whole world knew about it. Or even just cooking classes, which is a very, very common format around the world and is almost impossible to find here. How do we celebrate and kind of show off the diverse people? Why not take people on tours of different villages? You can take, or neighborhoods. I've taken tourists to the Uyghur neighborhoods of Almaty. So the largest Uyghur population in the world outside of China and Istanbul is here in Almaty. So I take them to Sultan Kurgan. I take them to Druzhba. We have Lagman. We visit the Uyghur mosque. We talk to Uyghur people. It's an amazing opportunity for people to explore not just Kazakh culture, but some of the other cultures of Kazakhstan. If you wanted to show off contemporary culture, you can arrange tours of galleries and of studios. Why not show off the nightlife? Take people on bar crawls, show them different formats. You can take them to a speakeasy, and then to a kabak, and then you can take them to a rave and a discoteca, and show them the whole kind of array of amazing, vibrant nightlife that Kazakhstani cities have. Toys is a difficult one, because I know for all foreigners who live in Kazakhstan, some of their favorite memories are going to Kazakh weddings. And so my colleague and I started developing this concept of how can we introduce Kazakh weddings to tourists? Why not create a program for wedding crashers, where if there's a foreign tourist who registers and wants to see a wedding, people who are throwing a wedding can invite them as guests of honor. And so foreigners can have the opportunity to see one of these celebrations, to participate in it, and to create memories that will last a lifetime. And then lastly, ways of exploring parts of the city that we love. I think most of the people in the audience today are probably Almatensi, Almatians. We know that this is the best city in the world, but how do we show that to people? How do we show those little things that I explore on Walking Almaty? What popular Almaty accounts calls Almatismi, the Almatisms. It's about showing those kind of smaller details, taking people through the dvors, taking them to the small dom museum that you can find in Almaty, to different neighborhoods like Kampot and Malay Stenica. Almaty itself has so much to offer. I try to do it through Walking Almaty, but there's a million other tour products that you could develop. So I put this together as just kind of a inspiration board, a motivation board for anybody in the audience who's interested in developing tourism here, developing especially this external tourist market. The thing I want to point out finally before we go to questions is how easy this is. One of the amazing things about the tourism industry is that it requires very, very little upfront capital at all. It requires you and your personal passion and interest and your ability to use a computer to set up a page on TripAdvisor, which is by far the largest tourist tour product platform in the world. This was all I did. I built a page for Walking Almaty. I think it took me 30 minutes 6 years ago, and I've met hundreds and hundreds of people since then because of this page. So if the barrier to entry is that low, and there are this many amazing opportunities for tour products, I encourage any of you to take the initiative yourselves, to try to create something new and interesting so that you can show your own country, your own city, your own culture to the rest of the world, and to help build up Kazakhstan's name recognition so that when people hear Kazakhstan, they don't just say "Где," they don't just say "Khaida," where is it? But they say, "Oh yeah, my buddy went there and he had this amazing experience," etc., etc. So I wish you guys luck. If you do choose to explore this tourism market, if you're already working in the tourism industry, and if any of you have questions or comments or ideas about it, I'm really looking forward to hearing from everybody. So yeah, so please, if anybody has questions, please feel free to raise your digital hand or to write the questions in the chat. Don't be shy. Если вы хотите на русском задать вопрос, тоже мне без разницы. Қазақшада сұрақ беруге болады. Well, it seems like people are shy. But I will wait a second just to see if anybody, если будут какие-нибудь вопросы, я рад ответить.
Здравствуйте, меня зовут Асия. А можно задать вопрос?
Да, конечно, можно.
А где вы сейчас находитесь?
Мои квартиры в Алматы.
В Алматы? Да,
Да.
вы так любите город Алматы. Спасибо большое вам. Вы, наверное, сейчас больше знаете Алмату, чем мы. И я, знаете, хотела вас спросить. У вас очень интересный сайт, и вся ваша деятельность очень интересна. Вы сейчас в этом направлении Walking Almaty работаете или нет?
Ну, Азия, вы не против, если я на английском буду отвечать?
Yes, okay. Yes,
Окей,
okay.
просто мне так проще. Well, of course, this has been an unusual year and a half since the pandemic began. So walking Almaty is a lot different now than it was 2 years ago.
Мгм.
The tourism traffic is a fraction of what it was before. So just as a baseline, if 2 years ago this is peak tourist season and I would have been giving 2 to 3 tours a day, now I'm giving 1 tour a week if
Oh,
I'm lucky. Why?
wow.
It's quite obvious because the borders are closed to almost all tourists. And so the only market that I have is local Almatinse or Kazakhstanse or expats who are living here. And unfortunately, walking Almaty was successful enough that over the last 5 years, I think I've met every single expat, every single foreigner who lives in Almaty. There's nobody left. So the market right now for me is the audience is quite small, but fortunately I have other projects that I work on. So I've shifted to doing more work in consulting, in tourism marketing and PR. And so that keeps me busy.
Окей, thank you. Спасибо.
Да, пожалуйста.
Жалко, конечно.
Ну что делать, да? Самое главное просто you can't stop working, you can't stop dreaming, and I hope it doesn't last forever.
Окей. Да, да. Спасибо в любом случае за вашу деятельность. I was really excited to hear from this point of view and your points, like to how to arrange. The thing is, I just realized that all the вот эти рекламы все с лошадьми, и действительно, it's not real life that на всех рекламных этих постах, которые в Казахстане делают, Казахтуризм, as you said, we should a bit change focus. Thank you for this point of view.
Yeah.
We will do remarks on it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, one last thing about that is that in order to change that point of view, I'm not the one who can do that, right? I'm just a single voice, and I'm an American, so I'm an outsider. The way to change that view is for local people to change their own perspective and to change their own attitude towards their own culture and their own history and their own cities and their own country. Because the reason why this isn't being marketed outwards is that even local people still have problems with this identity, with this Soviet legacy, with this urban landscape. There's if local people are uncomfortable with that, then of course they're not going to show it to outsiders, to visitors. So it's this psychological problem, actually, that first people have to develop themselves and develop their own relationship with their culture, develop their own relationship with real modern Kazakhstani life, and then they can share it with other people. It's a lot easier for me to do that because as an American, as an outsider, I'm detached from all of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the same emotional complexes that you might have if you've grown up here your whole life.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Aldiar, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, hello.
Hi.
My name is Aldiar. I just want to ask a question about thing that happens many times in Almaty when local power, local Akimat, they destroy historical buildings, but this historical buildings is connected to Soviet era. And what is your general opinion about destroying the buildings that was connected to Soviet period? Is it the right thing to do? Should we stick to this like Soviet period buildings and architecture, or should we establish something new that maybe like new unique way of architecture in Almaty?
If we're talking about Almaty, it's simply honest to recognize that most of the urban landscape here has a connection to the Soviet past, right? Most of the prominent buildings in the city were built in the Soviet Union. Most of the buildings where we live were built in the Soviet Union. So it's simply not realistic to expect that we can just get rid of this and forget about it and pretend like it didn't happen, right? So that's one thing. It's part of the landscape, and as part of the landscape, it has value, it has meaning to people, and it should be protected. Not everything deserves to be protected. Not every building is as valuable as another one, but there are specialists who work in the field who have identified works of architecture that should be protected. Through my research, I identify works of art and mosaics that should be protected. And on a positive note, Aldiar, I think things are changing. I think that in the time that I've lived here since 2013, I've seen a change in attitude where people are more appreciative of this Soviet architecture and art. People are more willing to fight for its protection. I think a lot of you might remember this summer when there was a mosaic in Almaty of a dragon on Dostok in Kormangazi that was destroyed. And it was a terrible thing. But what I saw was that people spoke up and there was anger and there was a public response. 5 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. 5 years ago, a lot of mosaics were being destroyed and nobody noticed. So I can see that people care more, and the more that people speak up and show their opinion, and the people in power will hear this opinion, hopefully these things will change. One last note, just to connect this to tourism, is that I think that they kind of complement each other, right? So the more you protect architecture, the more tourists appreciate that. And the more tourists appreciate architecture, the more local people in power realize how important it is. So it's a lot easier sometimes to argue about the value of the building when you say that it has tourist interest than when you say that it has historic interest, because that's just capitalism. If it has some kind of value, then it's going to be this tourist kind of financial value.
Okay, so
yeah, I
we
see.
have a few questions.
Yeah, were you going to read the questions from the chat, right?
Yes, well, we have one question, which is, what was the most unexpected thing you heard from travelers when you took them on tours in Almaty?
One thing that always gets me is there's certain people that actually know so little about Kazakhstan when they get here that they'll ask me things like, I keep seeing these people and they look Asian, but they're speaking Russian. Are those Russians or who are they? And I'll explain, no, there's Kazakh people who have an Asian appearance and they speak Russian. Ah, okay. But then there are these white people here. Like, who are the white people? Like, well, this could be Slavic people, like Russians, Ukrainians. So people seem to actually often be confused about who lives in Kazakhstan. And they often comment on all the different faces and appearances that they see. So that one always kind of takes me back, because like now for me, it's quite obvious, like who is Kazakh and who is Russian. But people get it mixed up. So that's always kind of unexpected for me.
Okay, also, there are a few questions on YouTube that I'm going to read out. So one of them is from Ayana, who is asking, how did you learn Kazakh?
How did I learn Kazakh? I got lucky to be able to participate in some Kazakh language programs in the United States. The first language program I participated in was a summer course at the University of Wisconsin called the Central Eurasian Studies Summer Institute, where for 3 months, I studied intensive Kazakh with a Kazakh linguist named Zaure Batayeva. After that, I spent an academic year at Stanford studying Kazakh with my professor, Alma Kunbayeva. And then I came to Almaty, and through the American Council's program, I studied Kazakh for 3 months at KMAP University. There's not a huge demand for Kazakh in the United States. When I teach basic Kazakh now at UCLA, we usually have about 5 students. But it's always amazing for anybody, I think, to learn Kazakh because it's such a magical language. And an amazing thing as well is that Kazakh language study in America is free. The United States government will pay for your education if you want to study Kazakh. So they paid for every program that I did. I never paid a single dollar. The United States government considers Kazakh to be a critical language and therefore sponsors Kazakh language education, which is really cool.
Thank you for the answer. We also have another question from the L user. She's saying, he or she is saying, wow, wonderful, Dennis. Thank you very, very much for your story and hints. Dennis, besides TripAdvisor, what other websites you could recommend to test your hypothesis?
Yeah, so I said TripAdvisor simply because it's by far the most widely used and it's very easy to set up a profile. There are other platforms that exist. One is called Viator. Airbnb has its own tour platform that, though it hasn't opened up in Kazakhstan, is supposed to open up. And then there's a Central Asian guide marketplace called Indie Guide that you could take a look at. Those are the platforms that I know that are oriented towards Western external tourists. And then of course you have Kazakhstani platforms as well.
Okay, and we have one more question from our YouTube broadcast, which is, have you heard anything from ID nomads from abroad? How we could attract them? What are your thoughts on this?
Could you, there was one word there I didn't quite hear.
It
have you
says
heard from which...
IT nomads from abroad.
Okay. If I understand the question correctly, by IT nomads, they might mean like digital nomads. And if I don't understand correctly, then please write again. But digital nomads, I think, is an amazing market segment that Kazakhstan has a lot to offer. And cities like Almaty offer an amazing quality of life that can compete with cities in Europe and North America, an amazing affordability because of the generous exchange rate between tenge and foreign currencies, friendly people, tax incentives, and fast and cheap internet. So I don't know what else more a digital nomad would want. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity there, but it would just have to be marketed with a kind of a dedicated program.
Okay, so that's all for YouTube questions. And here we have a question in Zoom chat, which is, Dennis, what do you think about Kazakh language switching to Latin, Latinisa? Is it good for tourism or it confuses travelers?
No, it's good, 100% good. Because you can imagine that probably 90% of external tourists who come to Almaty have no knowledge of Russian or Kazakh and have no knowledge of the Cyrillic alphabet. So if they are presented with a menu in Cyrillic, or they want to read a sign that's in Cyrillic, it's a struggle because they simply can't read it. And if Kazakh is written in Latin, then it at least allows them to sound it out, to type it into Google Translate, to have a guess about what it means. Very importantly, it makes it much easier to read street signs, to orient using maps. So I think this is actually one of the best reasons for switching to Latin. And it's why I support this transition.
Okay, so we have two people who are raising their hands. Yes, so first is Baljan.
Всем добрый вечер. Привет, Денис. Как дела?
Привет.
Как ты? Я давно слежу за твоей страницей в Инстаграме Walking Almaty, и ты делаешь офигительно крутые вещи. Как бы я согласен с тем, что здесь сказали, то, что ты знаешь больше, чем алматинцы, которые живут в Алмате, ну, знаешь больше про Алматы. И мне очень понравилась твоя идея относительно того, что строить, то есть ассоциации, да, ты говорил, какие должны вызывать ассоциации Казахстана. Твоя идея относительно вот космодрома, да, когда вот космонавты приземляются, да, на землю Казахстана и сделать ну, от этого как-то ассоциацию и проводить туры. Ты сказал, что ты был единственным туристом, когда вот прилетели космонавты. Я видел твои фотографии в Инстаграме. Вот. А у меня такой вопрос. А почему бы тебе не заняться этим вопросом, быть первым, кто организовал бы эти туры, когда вот прилетают космонавты, вот эта капсула и так далее? Там.
Мгм. Я могу сказать, что у меня есть интерес. И сейчас эта программа развивается, но пока об этом ничего не могу сказать. Так что, да, будем двигаться к этому направлению. Я считаю, что это очень вот перспективно, но это очень вот сложная программа и вот долго будет сработаться, так что пока вот более детально не могу сказать, какие планы есть, но планы есть.
Я желаю тебе успеха в этом направлении. И если ты это реализуешь, я думаю, что это будет очень круто, классно. И про Казахстан многие узнают с другой стороны. И да, действительно, у людей будет ассоциация именно с этим. Спасибо тебе за то, что ты делаешь. Ты очень крутой. Я тебя очень уважаю. Спасибо огромное.
Спасибо большое.
Спасибо за вопрос. Теперь руку также подняла Айжан. Айжан, вы можете включить микрофон и задать вопрос.
So good evening, everyone. Good evening, Dennis. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. I especially like the concept of wedding crashers. I think this can be very unusual and maybe perspective for future. And I have two questions. My first question is about I personally think that here in Kazakhstan and especially in Almaty, the industry of museums is not well developed. For example, if we compare our museums and the museums in Europe and America, so ours comparatively on very low level, not so digital, not so very informative. And like the number of museums is not enough. So as far as I know, there are around 16 or 15 museums in Almaty now. So how do you think that this can be an issue, and the number and the quality of museums is not good in Kazakhstan? How would you appreciate or maybe evaluate the condition of museums in our country?
Yeah, I agree 100% with your evaluation. And I believe that most tourists do as well. When I usually talk to my guests and they've been to the National Museum or they've been to the Almaty City Museum, nobody ever has good things to say. And it's quite shameful, to be honest.
Yeah.
Because obviously there's this rich history and this rich culture that we can show through these museums. That's what museums are for. But the format of the museums are 50 years behind. The rest of the world has learned to make museums more accessible to different audiences, right? To make them more friendly for children. And most importantly, to make them interactive. And the format of most Kazakhstani museums is quite old-fashioned, where it's just photograph, text. Not text. And even that, half the time, there's only text in Russian and Kazakh, and there's no text in English at all. Kazakhstani museums are usually built so that you must see them with a guide. And a guide will take you from step to step. But most Western tourists aren't interested in seeing museums with a guide. They want to guide themselves. So more self-guided content, more interactivity, more and better quality English language texts. There's a lot that can be done. Yeah,
okay, thank you for your answer. I really agree with you on that point, and maybe I haven't paid much attention, and that there is lack of information in English, but yeah, the quality, that lack of interactivity of content is really something that the direction where we can develop. So, and also I have the second question. For example, if we compare Kazakhstan with Russia, and from my own experience, when we discuss the topic of Russia, most people come. I think so that there is group of tourists that come to Russia, not like to visit to see the Russian architecture, to visit the Red Museum, but they come to Russia to have these vibes, so to say, like to feel the Russian Русская душа, Русская тоска, that to have those feelings, like to feel the country with a great history, with a great literature, with a very harsh fate. And if we, I mean that if you transfer this question in terms of Kazakhstan, how would you define in a spiritual and in an associative way, what is Kazakh identity for you? I mean that not in terms of history, not in terms of nature, culture, but like in terms of feelings and spirit.
I think that most of the Kazakhs in the audience would probably agree with me that if you want to experience that Kazakh spirit, you have to go to an aul, and not to an etno-aul, which is totally, the problem is it's totally empty of that spirit, but to a real village. And so there's a huge opportunity to develop this rural tourism in Kazakhstan. It's one project that I'm working on currently, is how do you build interest in these villages, build accommodation, build tour products where tourists can go to the village and they can feel that. Because when you go to the village and you stay with a Kazakh family, you feel that hospitality, that kind of Kazakh konak jaylaga, right? You taste real Nagaz Kazakh tamak, right? You feel that kind of warmth from people that you can experience in the city, especially in a very Russified city like Almaty. But this goes back to a point we were making before about Kazakhs' own identity and their own relationship with themselves and with their culture. Is that my question to you guys is, why do Kazakhstanis feel the need to make a fake etno-aul instead of bringing people to the real aul? And what I would suggest is that there's some kind of shame, that in some way people are ashamed of showing how people live. Maybe they're ashamed of poverty. Maybe they're ashamed of the backwardness, but there's some kind of shame that's stopping people from promoting auls as a destination. And so first, people have to deal with that kind of identity crisis before they're ready to share it with the world. So I hope that answers your question about where to find.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, yes, I got an answer to my question. Thank you. And as for regarding auls, I think that we really have many problems with that. Like not enough infrastructure is not developed. Like sometimes there is no electricity, no water, like no conditions for living, and even for the residents of aul. Not even speaking about the tourists. So yeah, it's a huge problem.
Well, an important thing to understand though is that for many of the external tourists who are coming to Kazakhstan, they're what we call adventure tourists. So they aren't looking for specific conditions. They aren't expecting to have nice toilets and electricity. In fact, somehow part of the experience for many Western travelers is that kind of lack of infrastructure, because it's something they've never experienced before. I never used an outhouse, like what do you guys call it? уличный туалет in my life before I went to a Kyrgyz village, and I used one there. And even just that, going outside and walking past the cow to use the toilet was for me kind of fun and interesting. And so for local people, they feel this shame that, oh, yat bolat, I don't want to, show this to these visitors, because that's that Kazakh mentality, right? But we have to kind of look at it from the other side, that for a lot of people, that's nothing to be afraid of. So friends, I think I actually personally only have time for one more question.
Okay, so we actually have just one more question, unless anyone asks. So a question from Jania, which is, what can be done with the capital city, which is, I suppose, Astana? And it has an on-the-rise university that is attracting international students, not a lot, but the number is surely increasing. Is there a way to use that opportunity to introduce more foreigners who are not technically tourists, but they still come to Kazakhstan to stay for 9 months or 4 years?
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, I would describe that as kind of the expat population, and Astana has Kazakhstan's largest expat population, not just students, but diplomats and business people and construction workers. And they too are interested in exploring the city, but Astana is a difficult place for a visitor. It's a difficult place for local people. But though it is not my favorite city, I do. Hi, everybody. It seems I lost connection there for a second. Am I back on?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so yeah, let me just complete my thought. Yeah, so there's a lot more in Astana than just the modern city. There is some interesting history there as well. I think an important, like one of the most difficult things that I always hear from my guests is that Astana is not a pedestrian-friendly city. Because most tourists who are coming are not going to have their own transport, they're not going to have their own cars, and so they're going to rely on public transportation, taxis, and walking. And so I think a lot more can be done as the city develops to make it a more pedestrian-friendly city, to prioritize pedestrian access, because that also just makes it easier for travelers to explore. So, it's interesting that you point out Nazarbayev University. Technically, Nazarbayev University students can walk across the street to Expo, and then can walk from Expo downtown. When you look at it on a map, it looks quite easy. But if you ever try to do it, it takes you an hour and a half to get anywhere, and it's not a very pleasant place to walk. So things can be done to make it more comfortable for that kind of audience.
Okay, so I think that was all with the questions, and you also have to go. So thank you for giving this lecture and answering the questions. And thank you for all the participants for asking questions, for engaging in the discussion. Hopefully you have enjoyed this. And we'll be just having a minute while everybody types in their thank yous. Yeah, so let me just say one last word. I want to thank leadership
for the invitation, for the opportunity to speak today. Thanks, Nailia, for moderating the session. And thank you guys all for joining me, for your attention and for your curiosity and your questions. I encourage everybody to stay in touch. Find me on Instagram, Sobachka Walking Almaty. Write to me, talk to me, ask me questions. And I hope I've inspired some of you to think of your own tourism projects for the future. So good luck, everybody. Good night.